was British territory until 1796, when the official turnover of the land occurred as a result of the British loss in the American Revolution. And this was pinned down with the Jay's Treaty of 1794. So after the American Revolution, which ended in 1783, the Detroit area was remained in under British control and was closely connected to what was called the South Shore, which is now Essex County, the Canadian side. So during this time under British control, again, the British, as I mentioned, enslavement grew substantially under British control. And in 1790, the British imperial government was encouraging settlers, some who would have been called late loyalists or just general white immigrants, to immigrate to different parts of the British colonies in the Americas. And this clause here, what it did was it supported and encouraged immigrants, white immigrants, to immigrate to places such as Canada, and it allowed them to import the black people that they enslaved, similar to household furniture, utensils of husbandry, or clothing that they owned, and that they would be allowed to import them and not pay any taxes, any duties on these goods or properties, as they were all categorized at the time when they were relocating. So during this time, hundreds of enslaved African men, women, and children were forcefully relocated to the British colonies here in Canada and at the end of the American Revolution. And they were part of the first wave of settlers from the US after the British loss. This led to the expansion of the practice of enslavement in the colony from their French predecessors. Many loyalists that immigrated north brought the black people that they enslaved with them, and as I mentioned here, they were encouraged to do so. There were also some French Canadians in this region in Essex County who enslaved black and indigenous people at this time as well, some of who I will highlight. So, with this large movement of loyalists into Canada from in eastern Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, into Quebec, and with the increased settlement here in Ontario, going all the way to the Detroit River area, loyalists were depending on the use of slave labor in their resettlement to clear land and to establish their homesteads. Here is a quote from some communication, military communication, where loyalists expressed that they themselves were receiving provisions from the military to support their family, to feed and clothe their families, but they were not able to support the black people that they enslaved out of their provisions and did not have the money to do so. However, despite the situation that they were in, they felt that to dispose of the slaves would have added to their distress, as they were the only means they had of cultivating their lands. And I show this as a way to demonstrate how slave labor was depended on, even though what happened in Canada, how enslavement uh, was functioning in Canada was different than plantation economies in the South, that nonetheless slave labor was still depended upon here, and was even, as I said, was even expected to increase. So the number of enslaved black people in Upper Canada and the other colonies increased, as I said. There were estimates that approximately 3,000 enslaved black people were brought into Canada, with an estimated 5 to 700 going to Upper Canada, which is now Ontario. The estimate that more than 500 Africans were enslaved in Upper Canada has been quoted by all historical works that discuss the topic of enslavement. I have been able to trace the original source of this estimate to a 1920 article by William Riddell that was published in the Journal of Negro History, in which he states that the number of slaves in the province at the time of the Act of 1793 was probably not far from 500, and writes in the notes that this is indicated by the number of facts, none of much significance, and altogether far from conclusive. But it is a mere estimate, perhaps not much more than a guess, and I should not be astonished if it were proved that the estimate was astray by 100 either way. And I share that because um, this is the number that's been used. But a question is, um, the question is how many black people were enslaved? And, sorry, one second. Just 1 second. I just want to make sure I'm checking that the feed is okay. Okay, sorry, seems to have been a little bit of a delay. Okay, so just to recap, um, as I was mentioning, that there's been an estimate that there were 500, between 5 to 700 black people enslaved in early Ontario, and that this number was drawn from a 1920 article written by William Riddell, and that was published in the Journal of Negro History. And so this number has been cited for 100 years. And during the course of that time, there has been no scholarship that has looked at this number, who has done an intensive study to look at, how many black people were enslaved in early Ontario. And so for me, that's an important question that I am pursuing in my research. The relocation of enslaved black people from the United States into British North America transplanted one slaveholding society to another, where they continued and adapted the customs and practices of enslavement, making enslavement in Upper Canada specific to its new regional location. And so part of my research that I have started is a statistical and textual analysis of a range of primary records in order to examine what enslavement looked like, but particularly to try to understand and communicate what the lives of the enslaved were like during this time period. My dissertation, I will talk about what that will look like a little bit later. So tonight I'm sharing specifically, as part of this presentation, a little bit about what the institution of enslavement was like in Essex County, and highlighting some of the individuals who were enslaved in Essex County. And so some of the areas that I will focus on is Sandwich, Gosfield, and Amherstburg and Windsor. So here are some of my initial findings. That there were over 90 enslaved people documented between 1782 and 1817. 20 were males, 20 were females. There were over 40 whose genders were not known. Of these over 90 enslaved black people, 10 were children as young as 1 week old. These were the known names of some of the known names of those who were enslaved: Jane, Pompey, James, Candace, Scipio, Abraham, Hannah, Peter, Therese, Rosalie, Leon, Jane, Ben, Jack, James, Hannah, Tom, Betsy, Sal, Nancy, Paul, Bill, Pierre, Polly, John Baptiste, Therese, another John Baptiste, Jacques, James Ford, Esther, Clara, and so many who were unnamed, identified only as Negro. And I do that intentionally to mention their names because oftentimes uh, those who were enslaved and in the writing of history, their names become erased. And really, the part of my work is to name and identify and try to humanize these individuals who were under such harsh, brutal conditions. The over 90 Black people who were enslaved by approximately 27 Loyalists, who I listed here on the right-hand side. It's important to note that the number of Black people who were enslaved in Essex County is higher. However, I did not count several enslaved Black people for a few reasons. One, those enslaved were counted in records but not identified by race, and they could have either been Black or Indigenous. And also, there's in some records where some people are identified as enslaved, it is still not very clear if they were enslaved on the US side of Detroit or the Canadian side of Detroit, which is now Essex County. And so I continue in my close examination of these records to narrow down these facts in quite a few cases. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share with you some of the stories of and the circumstances of enslavement of a few of the individuals who I've been able to locate in the historical records. The first were about 50 or 60 Black people who were noted as having been enslaved by Matthew Elliott in Fort Malden, now Amherstburg. This large number of enslaved Black people were engaged in a number of duties. This included clearing the land, building Matthew Elliott's large, grand homestead, farming, an array of domestic duties, carrying out jobs to support Elliott's role as the superintendent of Indian Affairs. It was recorded that some of his Negroes picked up bread from the Garrison Bakery to help deliver them to indigenous clients. However, in one record, it said that Elliott was getting those who he enslaved to pick up the bread and take 20 to 25 loaves per day to feed his workers on his estate. On the left here, you see a picture of the Elliott homestead as it was rebuilt. The original home was erected in 1784, and as I mentioned, that it would have been built largely by slave labor. The original home, was destroyed during the War of 1812, and it was later rebuilt by his children and his wife. On the right side is an image from the Amherstburg Freedom Museum, and it is an iron ring from a black locust tree that was on the Matthew Elliott property. And it was noted that it was on a tree called the Bloody Tree, and it was used apparently as a whipping post. And in that notation is an example of the treatment of enslaved people in early Ontario. Oftentimes, there's this idea or misinformation that somehow because enslavement was practiced in Canada, that it was more benign, that it was softer, kinder, gentler, and really and truly, the records do not bear that out. And as the title of my talk and my dissertation suggests, one too many, that the institution itself, no matter what number of people were held in bondage, was a harsh and inhumane institution. Matthew Elliott was um, also engaged in slave trading. Elliott was commissioned by Peter Russell, who was the first administrator of the province and who lived in downtown Toronto, to sell one of the black people that he enslaved, the wife named Peggy. And Peter Russell had reached out to Elliott in 1801, and Elliott tried to broker a sale from Russell to Mohawk chief Joseph Brant, who he himself had enslaved a large number, about an equal number to that of Elliott in Burlington. However, this deal fell through, and this, as a result, we see that Peggy was and her son Jupiter was subsequently put up for sale in the Upper Canada Gazette newspaper in 1806. In the fall of 1806, going into the winter of 1807, Elliott lost about 36 of the people that he enslaved. They fled to Detroit in pursuit of their freedom. And it was noted that almost all of them, the men, were serving in what was described as a renegade militia. It was a militia of black men led by a recently freed black man, and they were serving there in Detroit. Uh, and records also show that there was a subsequent group that followed this large group during that winter. And Matthew Elliott filed extradition papers with the U.S. government, and he ordered or requested that a number of those who he enslaved, Jane, Pompey, James, Candace, Scipio, Abraham, Hannah, and Peter, filed that they be returned to him in his home in here in Canada in Essex County. And so we are able to learn about that through court records to be able to name some of these individuals who were enslaved. And I should mention as well, in relation to his Elliott's slave trading, that Elliott sold an enslaved woman to Alexander Duff and his wife, and they were the first owners of the Duff Babé House. One of the black men who was enslaved by Elliott was a man by the name of James Ford, and his story is quite interesting. Here is a testimony of his daughter, Amy Martin, and it was recorded in some records relating to freedom seekers coming into Canada, documented by white abolitionist Samuel Gridley Howe. And so in her testimony, she talks about her father being enslaved in Virginia, that he was subsequently sold to Kentucky, and there was a large raid that involved quite a number of white loyalists, Indian agents such as Elliott, Henry Bird, who I will talk about soon, and they took with them quite a number of enslaved blacks from Kentucky into Detroit and into Canada. and James Ford was one of them. So he was sold. He was, as it mentions here, the Indians brought my father to Canada, I think to Fort Malden, and he was sold to a British officer who was Elliott. And James Ford was one of the enslaved men who ran away to Detroit and then went to Ohio. Um, and then he would later on settle in Pennsylvania and then make his way to live in St. Catharines, where he died. And so that story is quite interesting because when we're tracing the experiences and the lives of some of these individuals who were enslaved, James Ford's story is an example of Black people who were fleeing to the north of the United States, the Northwest Territories, in pursuit of their freedom. And oftentimes we only hear about American freedom seekers coming north into Canada. And another example of enslaved Africans who were brought into Canada as a result of this raid in Kentucky, there was a woman by the name of Esther. And Esther, as I said, was taken from Kentucky as part of the raids there in Kentucky and brought into Detroit, and then was sold to Captain Henry Bird. And so here are a documentation of Henry Bird explaining how he was able to obtain Esther from the Indians. An Indian chief gave him permission to have her, and that was at the end of the war there, as I mentioned. And then Henry Bird relocated to settle in Amherstburg and Fort Malden, bringing those that he enslaved with him, including Esther. And in 1794, it is documented that Henry Bird sold or gave away his rights. He gave away Esther to a man by the name of William Lee. And it says that here I do hereby make over and give away my right and property in the said wench and her male child to William Lee in consideration of his having cleared for me 16 acres of land. Now this example, this story is also interesting and brings another element as well. Here we see again the involvement of Indigenous allies to the British who played a role in the trading of African people in Ontario. At the time of her sale, between the time that Henry Bird obtained Esther to the time that she was given to William Lee, she had recently given birth to a boy child. And what is also interesting is that William Lee was a free Black man. Uh, Apparently, and seemed to be a recently free man, likely a Black Loyalist. And so while the records do not indicate their relationship, there is an inference here that perhaps the child was Esther and William Lee may have been in a relationship, and Esther bore a child, and that William Lee was working for Henry Bird, and that this was one of the ways that Esther was able to obtain her freedom was through this and maintain her relationship was through this exchange. So the enslavement of Black people in Essex County is a complicated connection between the U.S. side and the Canadian side. And there's a great book by Tia Miles, The Dawn of Detroit, which takes a look at that as well. And so Detroit, as I said, remained a British hub after the American Revolution until 1796. And then those who wanted to remain British subjects had to move over to the Canadian side and take up their land grants. John Askin was one of those people. John Askin was a fur trader, a merchant in Michigan. He had partnerships with other merchants such as Robert Hamilton and Richard Cartwright, and these men were also they also enslaved black people where they resided in Kingston and in Niagara, and which raises a question: did their business endeavors include slave trading? Another noted partner or business associate of James Askin was James McGill, who was one of the supplier of goods. And again, James McGill, the founder of McGill University, was himself an enslaver. And John Askin was also a politician. So John Askin lived in Detroit for some time. One of the black people that he enslaved was known because of a court case. The young man's name was Joseph Cutton, and Askin actually did a bit of gambling, purchasing Joseph when he was on trial for breaking and entering into Joseph Campbell's house in Detroit. But Joseph Cutton was tried by Chief Justice William Dummer Powell. He was found guilty and he was subsequently hanged in 1792. Um, John Askin would go on to come and relocate in Sandwich in 1802, and his property was named Strawbane, where named after where he was from in the UK, and settled in Sandwich East. Askin brought with him a few of the black people that he may continue to enslave, including a man by the name of Ben. By 1807, Askin was trying to sell Ben into the U.S. And because in 1793, which I will talk about a little bit soon, legislation was passed in Ontario to gradually abolish enslavement. So in Askin records, this is just a snippet from his records where Askin is in need of liquidating assets, if you will, and is proposing the sale of Ben to James Fraser in order to pay his debt. However, James Fraser replies that um, he would like to entertain the sale, but he says that the times are too critical to risk much in that way because the issues of the legalities of enslavement are not confirmed by the court. And so this is something that, he didn't want to weigh into and potentially lose any financial gain. So, in terms of those who were enslaved by John Askin on both sides of the Detroit River, uh, Askin lived in considerable comfort. He had a huge estate full of carriages, silver plates, mahogany furniture, and a well-stocked library. And all of these would have been upkept by those that he enslaved. There were also the black people who were enslaved by French Canadians, such as the Babes, a well-known family in Essex County. Francis Babé inherited two women and a child from his father, Jacques Babé, and he resided in Windsor in Maison François Babé, which is now Museum Windsor. Francois and his wife Frances Abbott would have had these women working primarily as domestics in their home. And then James Babé, his brother, who was a politician and a judge, he inherited the Duff Babé house in Sandwich upon his mother's death. James, who is seen here on the right, he bought a Negro boy named Frank, who was 12 years old, in October of 1793 in an estate sale that was held in Detroit. And it's interesting to note this because he bought Frank 1 year after being elected and 3 months after the passage of the 1793 Act to limit slavery. I also wanted to point out here through these first couple of stories that the interconnectedness of the social arrangements, such as marriages and businesses, are connected to the institution of slavery. The purchase, the sale, and the enslavement of Black people were part of these social arrangements. Next to the Black people who were enslaved by James Gerry in the Gosfield area. James Gerry was also an Indian agent, and he was also able to obtain the Africans that he enslaved through some of the raids during the wartime. And here is James Gerry's will, which was drawn up in 1804 and was probated in 1817, if you can imagine. And this still remained on the books in 1817, which speaks to the persistence of enslavement in early Ontario. So in his will, he bequeaths to his son James 6 Negro slaves, or as many of them that may be living at the time that he passes away. He bequeathed to his son Jim, Hannah, Joe, Jack, Betsy, and Tom, and also the children which may hereafter be born of the said Hannah and Betsy, the two women. He also bequeathed to his daughter the Negro wench Sal, and the Negro woman Nancy and her 5 children. Nancy was obtained by through his wife's property ownership, and was intended for his daughter Anne or Nancy. And no, it's worth to note that also the children of Nancy who were born of their bodies and their children's body were also being passed on in this will. And that is the reason why I focused here on the womb of enslavement, because enslavement was hereditary through the status of the mother, similar to other places in the Atlantic world. And even though legislation was passed in 1793 to gradually abolish slavery, we see here that individuals like James Gerry intended on benefiting, and their families benefiting, from the enslavement of Black people for as long as they could through the womb of enslaved women. In his will, he did also allow for the manumission of his Negro slave Paul, who would for his long and faithful service. And so through this will is one example of the documentation, and it also demonstrates how enslavement was upheld through property law in Ontario. So as I had mentioned about the 1793 Act to limit slavery, it was introduced in March of 1793, and the Cowie Cooley incident in Niagara-on-the-Lake, then Newark, was used as an impetus by Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe and Attorney General John White to introduce legislation to abolish slavery. However, because about half of the politicians in the province were themselves enslavers, they did not want to abolish slavery. And so the result was this compromise bill where slavery would be gradually abolished over a few generations. And so what this legislation did is it confirmed that slavery was indeed practiced and it was legal, and it was documented in this legislation. The first clause said that nothing herein shall be construed as being freeing the slaves. And in fact, it said that it confirmed that they would remain slaves for life unless manumitted by those who enslaved them. It then allowed for gradual abolition in that children born after 1793 would remain enslaved until the age of 25, and then the children that those children had would be born into freedom. And so this speaks to the persistence of the practice of slavery, and again, it really contradicts this idea that with this legislation that slavery was abolished, or that somehow slavery just was eradicated. And as I mentioned before, it continued It was confirmed and went well into the 1800s. There was legislation that was introduced in 1798 to reverse this piece of legislation, and it actually the passed in voting that the majority of the politicians agreed to reverse this to open up and allow for enslavement, the continuation of enslavement, to encourage settlers to come in the province. However, the bill was killed when the parliament was ended. But again, this speaks to the fact that the ideology, the attitudes, the belief that undergirded enslavement remained persistent and strong at that time. So I'm delving deeper into as part of the lives of those who were enslaved. What did their labor entail, and what were the contributions in labor to the individuals that enslaved them and to the colony of Upper Canada? What did they do? Their labor was exploited for the benefit of the Loyalist families and, by extension, the colony. And the labor that was stolen from enslaved Black people was gendered. Women contributed reproductive labor through the children that they bore, because, as I mentioned, the children that they bore remained or became additional property for those that enslaved them, and and grew the wealth of the loyalists of the families that held them in bondage. Their productive labor was primarily as domestic servants, and they did a range of chores, including taking care of the children, um, cleaning, cooking, laundry, sewing, making candles and butter, gardening, and whatnot. They did a range of work. And then, as for the men who were enslaved in early Ontario, including in Essex County, they contributed tremendous labor to the development of the colony through the clearing of land, constructing some of the early buildings, barns, the lavish homesteads that some of these loyalists talked about owning, clearing roads for in the development of the colony. They contributed a lot of skilled labor as blacksmiths and other skilled trades. And as I mentioned, helped to establish the homesteads, the farms that these white colonists who enslaved them benefited from. Many of them and some enslaved men were also engaged in a range of domestic labor. Some of them were noted as manservants and participated and did a lot of domestic work as well. Those who were enslaved, men and women, worked alongside their enslavers in the businesses that they operated. So whether it was those who were enslaved by Askin, they worked along in the fur trade. Um, they worked in the taverns that they owned. There was a tavern keeper in Amherstburg by the name of James Donaldson, and he enslaved two people, a man and a woman. So their labor would have contributed to the operations of that tavern. And it's interesting to note that in all of the reports of loyalist settlement where they talk about how much they've improved their land, none of these reports account for the use of slave labor. It's something that is invisible. And so my research seeks to highlight their daily experiences, not only as laborers, but as women, as wives, as mothers, as fathers, as husbands. How do we know about those who were enslaved, and what are some of the records that myself and other scholars who are looking at slavery, what records do we look at? There's a lot of information or some information in military returns and communications, census counts, town censuses, court records, wills, letters, diaries, bills of sales, church records, document births, baptism, and deaths of those who were enslaved. In Essex County, the Catholic and the Anglican churches have some documentation, as well as narratives such as the one I shared with you from Amy Martin. So when looking at through some of these records, it helps to develop and understand it and to document the structuring of enslavement. As colonists, those who were enslavers engaged in a range of economic activities and worked to establish their families and settle the colony. Just like at other British colonies, they used slave labor to help in these activities and to increase their wealth and profitability. And many loyalists uh, at the times where they may have faced financial difficulty, sold the black people that they enslaved in order to help alleviate that. And some of these comes out through some of the records that I've encountered and that I am gathering. And what I'm doing is in writing my dissertation, I'm also planning on putting these records together in a database um, as a way to make it accessible. So, getting back to the guesstimate of William Riddell, how many Africans were enslaved in Upper Canada? Um, my effort is to conduct an enumeration of those who were enslaved as a way I said, to deepen the scholarship and the research. And I recognize as well that 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 task is, raises a lot of questions around, and these critical questions have been raised by some scholars around being mindful of not recommodifying those who were enslaved through this enumeration process. And so, what I will be doing, um, I said, in focusing and centering on the lives of those who were enslaved, is to include some narratives of those who were enslaved. And that is an important qualitative contribution to give substance and depth and voice to the experiences of enslaved black men and women. The grand narratives of Loyalist settlers and the memorials that honor them, such as the plaques that honor, for example, Matthew Elliott in Essex County, John Butler in Niagara area. None of these memorials acknowledge those who were enslaved. In fact, their slaveholding practices are completely excluded from those records. And there's only brief mention of these enslaved individuals, as mere property. And so the efforts of my research and the use of narratives aims to disrupt that. And I'm doing that through piecing together some of these, loose or fragments, archival fragments, weaving them together to better understand and appreciate those who were held in bondage, including those who I briefly shared with you today, such as James Ford. So, in conclusion, slavery in Ontario and more broadly in Canada was complex and had informed in its own iteration. The Canadian brand of enslavement was very much part of the transnational system of enslavement that forcefully imported Africans to the New World and produced and consumed slave produced goods here as well. In whichever way it operated, enslavement and settler colonialism were definitively constitutive of each other in early Canada, and the specific enslavement of Africans by Loyalists led to the growth of the institution of slavery and the explicit definition of race-based slavery here in the Canadian context. The history of the enslavement of Africans reveals details on race and slavery in Canada and the early racial formation of the colonies. It's clear that white propertied men, and this propertied include those who were enslaved, um, and military veterans held the most power in the emerging colony, whereas the majority of blacks in the colony who were held in bondage were property with no rights. And then to add another complex layer to this racial stratification, indigenous people kidnapped and sold enslaved Africans. And through this understanding, race is clearly demarcated: who the colonizers were, who the enslaved laborers were, and this was marked by their black skin. It was also complicated because at this time there were also freed blacks, some black loyalists and those recently freed or freedom seekers, and they lived in the same spaces, and if were part of the same families as well. Um, and so race often determined where black people could be and could not be. The men who were establishing the British colony of Upper Canada saw racial slavery as a necessary tool for its development, like other slaveholding jurisdictions. The social construction of race in the British colony replicated ideas of race in other colonial places and in the New World, where white superiority was reinforced by racial difference and the subordination of people of African descent. My research will substantially build on previous and contemporary research in a way that centers the lives of African men, women, and children who were enslaved on these lands. The lives of these enslaved people matter. It mattered then and it mattered today. So thank you very much. Um, I did want to say thank you for the time. And before I open up to take some questions, I did want to point to the Ontario Black History Society's website and social media. We kicked off a campaign yesterday to push for the integration of Black history into the curriculum. And so I encourage you to check out one of these platforms and to view our ad, a video, and to lend your support and to amplify this cause. So thank you very much. And we'll take some questions. If you could just give me a moment here. Okay, so how can I see the questions? So if you have questions, if you could put them in the chat. Thank you for the comments, Chantel and Irene. Barbara Kath, thank you very much. So a question, do you know which indigenous tribes took part in the enslavement and theft of African men and women? So there were several. Uh, I know that there's some engaged with the British, the Shawnee, the Mohawk were of note as well because Joseph Brant, as as the chief of the Mohawk and one of the strong allies as well. So some of those and the Six Nations were involved as well. And so quite a bit of the military records at that time do talk about how their indigenous partners or friends were bringing in and passing on and selling slaves, the Africans that they enslaved. So am I seeing evidence of slaves being able to purchase their freedom, maybe through years of service or some other way? I have not come across any documentation of manumission where someone was able to purchase their freedom. No. So far, just in regards to obtaining their freedom, a few enslaved black people were promised their freedom in wills. And so another question was, could I speak further about resources? What did you have Which did you find have the most information? Did you find most of your information in the archives, or were there other locations that provided sources? So that's a great question. So I hope I shared, answered it a little bit. I shared some of the records that I've been going through. Um, so yes, through the archives, so going into some actual archives, but then there's also records that are digitized as well. And one of the in I also look at the role of the archives as it relates to slavery, because uh, in the archives as a colonial institution, and a place that houses, gathers and collects and preserves the records of colonizers. Um, those who were enslaved, we don't get the records from those who were enslaved. And so I have to rely on the records that viewed and treated Black people as property. And also in the archives, in terms of archival practices, there are no, archives don't have a collection or a fond that is labeled as slavery. And so I have to go through the records of individuals, of organizations, for example, that have documentation through there. So it does take quite a bit of time to go through and identify these records. And so that's why I said, really then um, requires that I put together these pieces, these archival fragments, to create a fuller picture. Thank you for the well wishes. Any other questions? Thank you, Kimberly. Wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. So manumission means purchase of freedom. So manumission, yes, but then there's also those who would have been manumitted, so granted their freedom as well. So, Brittany Ann, what do you see as a challenge right now for historians having to do a majority of the research remotely or through online records? Well, if the records are online, then that is great. But if not, research has essentially stalled. I'm further along in my research, and so a lot of my trips to actual archives is pretty much complete for the purpose of completing my dissertation, the writing of my dissertation. Um, but that has posed a huge challenge for graduate students and scholars. The fact that the archives are not accessible right now. Uh, Don asked, did the blacks enslaved in Essex County have marked graves anywhere? Not to my knowledge. Um, There is a video link that will be shared as part of the resources. There is an archaeological study. One was done previously years before, but there is an archival study, a closer look at the property, at Matthew Elliott's property. And so I believe that there was some readings uh, in terms of potential remains on the property, and so we'll see what yields there. But this is also something that I look at more broadly, not just in Essex County, Don, where there are, when we look at, for example, some of the burial records, there in relation to, I guess, the total number of those who were enslaved, those who were acknowledged as passing away, the numbers are very small. And then there are no markers. So it really is, and it's hard to swallow that. How were these people treated in death? Where were they buried? There are no markers. And so that's something I do hope in the longer term, once I finish my dissertation, to contribute to larger projects that, and I think Irene and I had a talk about this briefly, about marking some of the places, maybe not burial sites, but some of the locations where Black people, enslaved Black people were mentioned. were held and lived and worked and passed away. So Chantel asked, you said I mentioned Sal twice. Um, was that the same person? That may have been an error. So Sal may have actually been an error of mentioning twice, but the other names mentioned twice were different people. Thank you very much, Don. My dissertation is in progress, so I am not, it's not finished yet, Brittany, and eventually there will be something for the public to read from that. I see a question here from John. It is a challenge to find and confirm the evidence and stories found. It is, it's a challenge and it's painstaking. I really enjoy it though, putting together a lot of these pieces and creating a fuller picture. And for me, if I can answer some of these questions for myself, that I hope that it really presents a fuller picture of who these individuals are to those who I'm sharing their stories with. Um, and in doing this research, I do look at some of the landscape much differently. So, for example, the research that I've done, looking at those who were enslaved in Toronto, downtown Toronto, because Toronto is closest to me. When I walk in some of those spaces, when I look at Sherburne and Adelaide, where William Jarvis estate was, and he enslaved 6 people, I look at the landscape much differently, and I try to think about, or I often just reflect on and think about, the fact that these enslaved people, these people who were enslaved, would have walked in these same very spaces a couple of 100 years ago. So thank you very much for all of the positive feedback. I really enjoyed the opportunity to share my work with you on, the history of slavery in Essex County, and to share the names and just very briefly the lives of some of these people who were enslaved. And I encourage you to learn more. I've shared some resources that the museum will share publicly, and looking forward to sharing more with you in the future. So have a great night.